Why are all these women married? Mrs. D, Mrs. I, you're supposed to be teaching spelling, not poetry.
30 years after a small girl with a library card and a stare that could move a glass of water took over movie theaters everywhere, almost nobody from that cast ended up where you'd expect. One of them quietly stepped off the Hollywood conveyor belt before she'd even hit her teens and became a completely different kind of public figure. One of them survived a serious illness in her 40s and, instead of slowing down, picked up a camera for the first time and directed her own film. One actor got hurt for real while playing the most terrifying adult in the movie. And one beloved performer carried a private battle with cancer for 6 years, right through interviews, conventions, and public appearances, without almost anyone knowing. The real story of the Matilda cast in 2026 is stranger, sadder, and honestly more interesting than anything that happened on screen. Let's start with the girl who made the whole thing work in the first place. Mara Wilson was only 9 years old when she stepped into Matilda Wormwood's shoes, but by then she was already one of the most recognizable child actors on the planet. She'd made her film debut a few years earlier as Natalie in Mrs. Doubtfire, then followed it with Miracle on 34th Street, so by the time Matilda came around, audiences and studios alike already adored her. Behind the scenes, though, her life was anything but easy. Mara grew up as the fourth of 5 children in a busy Los Angeles household, and during the same period she was becoming famous, her mother, Susie, was diagnosed with breast cancer. Susie passed away in the spring of 1996, shortly after Matilda finished filming, when Mara was still just 8 years old. That loss reshaped everything that came after. Mara has said in interviews and in her own writing that after her mother died, film sets became one of the only steady, predictable places left in her world, which is part of why she kept working for a few more years even as the roles for a young teenager started to dry up. She appeared in A Simple Wish in 1997 and then Thomas and the Magic Railroad in 2000, which turned out to be her final film role as a child. She's spoken about turning down other auditions around that time, including one for Donnie Darko, and by the time she reached her early teens, she had essentially stepped away from film acting altogether. That transition wasn't smooth. She's admitted that once the acting stopped, she genuinely didn't know what to do with herself, because Hollywood had become something she leaned on emotionally even while she was growing unhappy inside it. What came after, though, turned into one of the more compelling second acts of any former child star. Mara finished high school, went on to study at New York University, and built an entirely new identity for herself as a writer, playwright, and stage performer, rather than returning to film. Some of that shift was just the nature of the industry, which tends to lose interest in child stars the moment they stop being children. But a lot of it came from Mara actively preferring to write and perform on stage rather than be constantly filmed and scrutinized. She's also written candidly about how uncomfortable and even predatory public attention toward her became as she got older, and she chose to speak about that honestly rather than staying silent, which turned her into one of the more thoughtful public voices on the long-term costs of child stardom. In 2016, she published a memoir called Where Am I Now? True Stories of Girlhood and Accidental Fame, where she wrote openly about growing up in the public eye and about living with obsessive-compulsive disorder, anxiety, and depression. She's continued to talk about those experiences because she wants other people going through similar struggles to feel less alone, and her message to anxious young people, that struggling with anxiety isn't some kind of personal failure, has resonated with a lot of readers over the years. Since around 2012, she's taken on select acting roles again, including voice work as Jill Pill on BoJack Horseman and a recurring part in the Big Hero 6 animated series, alongside stage work like her solo show Weren't You That Girl. By 2026, Mara Wilson is 39 years old, living in New York, still writing, still advocating for child performers' rights and mental health awareness, and she's remained close friends with one of her Matilda castmates for 3 decades, which we'll get back to later. At this point, she spent far more of her life outside of film acting than inside it, and that fact alone says a lot about who she chose to become after Matilda ended. Then there's the man who made almost every creative decision on that film besides playing Matilda herself. Danny DeVito directed Matilda, produced it, narrated it, and played her father, Harry Wormwood, which means his fingerprints are genuinely all over every frame of it. Many people still consider it one of the best family films of the 90s, and that's largely because of the choices DeVito made as a director rather than just as an actor. But the detail that tends to stick with people who look closer at that production has less to do with what's on screen and more to do with what was happening around it. Mara Wilson was living through her mother's illness and death during filming, and by all accounts, DeVito and his real-life wife at the time, Rhea Perlman, became genuinely caring, protective figures for her off-camera, even while playing her neglectful parents on screen. Wilson has spoken about feeling safe on that particular set, and given how unsentimental she's generally been about the costs of childhood fame, that comment carries real weight. As a director, DeVito also made the choice to keep Roald Dahl's sharper, darker edges intact rather than softening them for a younger audience, which is a big part of why the film has aged as well as it has. Miss Trunchbull stayed genuinely frightening, the Chokey stayed unsettling, and the chocolate cake scene was allowed to feel enormous and uncomfortable and funny all at once. DeVito never really slowed down after Matilda. Over the following decades he became one of the most recognizable actors in American film and television, known for Taxi, Twins, Batman Returns, and LA Confidential, and then found an entirely new audience through his manic performance as Frank Reynolds on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. By 2026 he's 81 years old and still working, which on its own is remarkable, but for a lot of people, Matilda remains the clearest example of what he could do as a filmmaker rather than just as a performer. Rhea Perlman played Zinnia Wormwood, Matilda's loud, self-absorbed, bingo-obsessed mother, with the kind of full comic commitment that made the character genuinely funny rather than just cartoonish. By the time Matilda came out, Perlman was already a television legend thanks to her role as Carla Tortelli on Cheers, a part that earned her 4 Emmy Awards over the course of that show's run. There's also a real-life detail people still find charming. Perlman and DeVito were actually married at the time they played this thoroughly mismatched screen couple. The two married in 1982 and had 3 children together, Lucy, Grace, and Jacob. Their relationship went through periods of separation and reconciliation over the following decades, but they never divorced, and they've continued to speak warmly about each other and their family. Their daughter, Lucy DeVito, went on to become an actress herself, which adds another layer to how rooted this film actually was in one real creative family. Perlman kept working steadily in film and television in the years after Matilda, and her performance as Zinnia has held up well specifically because it's built on character rather than volume. She understood exactly who this shallow, self-involved woman was, and playing that failure so convincingly is part of what makes Miss Honey's warmth land so powerfully by contrast later in the film. For a lot of kids who grew up watching Matilda, Miss Honey felt almost too gentle and kind to be real, and Embeth Davidtz played her with a softness that a lot of people still remember decades later. What's striking is where Davidtz already stood in her career by the time Matilda came out. She'd already delivered a haunting performance as Helen Hirsch in Schindler's List a few years earlier, and after Matilda she kept building a serious, varied career with roles in films and shows like Junebug, Bridget Jones's Diary, Mad Men, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and The Morning Show. Then, in her late 40s, her life shifted in a way few people would have predicted. Davidtz was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she's spoken publicly and candidly about how disorienting that experience was, including how strange it felt to look at herself in the mirror during chemotherapy. Even so, she said she never truly believed she would lose that fight, and the illness ended up sharpening her sense of what she wanted to do with the rest of her career. Around the same time, she found herself growing less interested in acting itself, partly because the industry was offering her fewer roles that felt meaningful. For a lot of performers, that combination might have meant the end of a career. For Davidtz, it turned into the start of something new. Years earlier, she'd read Alexandra Fuller's memoir Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight, about growing up on a farm in Rhodesia during the Bush War, and the material stayed with her. When she couldn't find a writer or director who understood the story the way she did, she decided to write the screenplay herself and direct it, something she had never done before. She said the process took roughly 20 drafts over several years, taught herself to write by simply sitting down and doing it, and drew on her own childhood growing up in South Africa during apartheid to shape the story alongside Fuller's memoir. The finished film, also called Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight, premiered at the Telluride and Toronto International Film Festivals in 2024, received strong reviews, and was picked up for distribution by Sony Pictures Classics. Davidtz both directed the film and starred in it as the mother, Nicola Fuller, opposite young newcomer Lexi Venter. For someone making her first feature as a director in her 60s, that's a genuinely significant achievement, and there's a nice symmetry in the fact that the woman so many people remember as the kind adult who finally saw Matilda clearly has now built a film around seeing the world through a child's eyes herself. By 2026, Embeth Davidtz is 60 years old, a breast cancer survivor, and a first-time film director with a well-received debut behind her, decades after she was simply known as the gentle teacher in a Roald Dahl adaptation. Then there's the adult in Matilda who was actually terrifying, on screen and, for one memorable moment, off-screen too. Pam Ferris played Miss Trunchbull, and in real life she is about as far from that character as you could imagine, a warm and deeply respected character actress who was born in Hanover, Germany, in 1948 to Welsh parents, and who had already been working steadily in British television since 1970 by the time Matilda came along. Ferris played Trunchbull with total conviction rather than any wink or cartoonish distance, hurling hammers, terrorizing children, and declaring herself essentially a small-scale tyrant ruling over her own school. That physical commitment came at a real cost during filming. In the scene where Trunchbull swings a young girl by her pigtails and throws her, Ferris actually injured her hand badly enough to need hospital treatment. It's worth noting that in most other major adaptations of the story, Miss Trunchbull has typically been played by men, from the original stage musical through to Emma Thompson's version in the 2022 film adaptation of the musical, which makes Ferris's original performance stand apart even more. Her career going into Matilda was already substantial, including The Darling Buds of May and a string of British costume dramas, and afterward she went on to play Aunt Marge in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, giving her the unusual distinction of having tormented two of the most beloved child characters in modern family entertainment. Her later work included Children of Men, Gavin and Stacey, and a long run as Sister Evangelina on Call the Midwife between 2012 and 2016, a role she's actually returning to briefly in 2026. At 78 years old, Pam Ferris is still very much active in an acting career that has now stretched across more than 5 decades. One of the most famous individual scenes in the entire film belongs to Bruce Borgtrater, the boy forced by Miss Trunchbull to eat an enormous chocolate cake in front of the whole school as punishment, only for the moment to flip into one of the film's great acts of defiance when his classmates start cheering him on. The actor who played Bruce was Jimmy Karz, and what happened to him after the film is arguably even more satisfying than the scene itself. Karz left acting a couple of years later, after small roles in The Wedding Singer and an episode of ER, and spent time working as a production assistant for MTV News before deciding he wanted more service-oriented work. He got into community gardening and volunteer teaching in low-income neighborhoods, and that experience eventually led him toward medicine.